Picture this. You're standing in 8th century Scandinavia, and the winter darkness has settled over the land like a suffocating blanket. The temperature has dropped so far below freezing that your breath crystallizes before it leaves your mouth. This isn't just cold. This is the kind of cold that kills. The kind of cold that separates the living from the dead based on one simple criterion. Do you know the old ways? Now, when I say the old ways, I'm not talking about some mystical nonsense or romantic notions about noble savages. I'm talking about 7 specific, brutally practical techniques that meant the difference between seeing another spring and becoming a frozen corpse that someone would find when the snows melted. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were life and death knowledge passed down through generations of people who lived in what might have been the harshest environment human beings had ever attempted to call home. Water divining through willow wands, fire summoned from fungus and flint, shelters built to breathe with the wind, meat preserved in bog acids and sea salt, stars read like runes across the sky, weather predicted through bone aches and bird flights, and resources shared through iron-bound oaths of mutual survival. 7 techniques. That's it. Master them all, and you live. Forget even one, and the land claims another victim. Let me tell you about Ragnar Icewalker, whose story became the teaching tale that Viking parents would whisper to their children on the longest nights of winter. This is 793 after Christ, and Ragnar has just committed the unthinkable. He's killed another member of his clan. Now, clan justice in 8th century Norway wasn't particularly complicated. You killed someone, you got cast out. Simple as that. No appeals process, no second chances. Pack your things and walk into the wilderness, because you're no longer welcome among the living. Most men sentenced to winter exile lasted, perhaps 3 days, maybe a week, if they were particularly tough or lucky. Ragnar lasted 40 days. 40 days in the killing cold of a Scandinavian winter, using nothing but those 7 ancient techniques that his grandmother had beaten into his skull since he was old enough to hold a knife. Think about what 40 days means in that environment. We're talking about temperatures that would make a modern Minnesota winter feel like a tropical vacation. We're talking about storms that could bury a man in snow faster than he could dig himself out. We're talking about a landscape so hostile that simply finding water became a life-or-death puzzle that had to be solved every single day. But Ragnar knew the first technique. Water divining through willow wands. Now, before you roll your eyes and dismiss this as superstition, consider this. These people had been living in this environment for 500 years. 5 centuries of brutal natural selection, where the techniques that didn't work got their practitioners killed, and the techniques that did work got passed down to the next generation. When Ragnar's grandmother taught him to cut a Y-shaped branch from a hazel tree and hold it just so, with his thumbs pointing up and his wrists twisted outward, she wasn't teaching him magic. She was teaching him hydrology. On his 3rd day of exile, when his water skin had run dry and the local streams had frozen solid under 3 feet of ice, Ragnar used that hazel rod to find running water. Not the stagnant stuff that would give him gut rot and kill him slowly, but the clean, flowing water that bubbled up from underground springs. He followed that rod as it twitched and pulled in his numb hands until he found a spot where the ice was thin enough to break through. Water. Life. But water alone wouldn't save him when night fell and the temperature dropped to levels that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. That's where the second technique came in. Fire summoned from fungus and flint. Ragnar's hands were so cold he couldn't feel his fingers, couldn't even tell if he was gripping his fire steel properly. But his grandmother had made him practice this technique until he could do it blindfolded, until the motions were burned into his muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Amadu fungus. That's what they called it. It grows on birch trees, and when it's properly prepared, it catches sparks like it's been soaked in oil. Ragnar scraped shavings from his tinder bundle with fingers that felt like wooden sticks, struck his steel against flint until sparks cascaded into the waiting fungus, and breathed life into those tiny glowing embers until they bloomed into flame. Fire. Warmth. Another day of life purchased with ancient knowledge. By the end of his first week, Ragnar had constructed a shelter using the 3rd technique, building structures that breathed with the wind instead of fighting against it. This wasn't some crude lean-to that would collapse in the first major storm. This was architecture learned through generations of people who understood that in a land where the wind could kill you, you needed to make the wind your ally. He dug into a hillside, angling his cave precisely so that warm air would be trapped inside while the poisonous gases from his fire could escape. He built walls of snow blocks cut to specific dimensions, each block placed to channel airflow in patterns that his ancestors had discovered through trial and error. The shelter breathed. It lived, and it kept Ragnar alive through storms that would have killed him in any conventional structure. These techniques weren't accidents or lucky discoveries. They were the product of 500 years of the most unforgiving natural selection imaginable. Every winter, the land would test the people who lived there. Every winter, those who had forgotten the old ways would die, and those who remembered them would survive to pass that knowledge on to their children. The Norwegian fjord dwellers developed different methods than the Swedish forest folk. The Danish coastal Vikings perfected their own techniques using seaweed and sand. But the wisest elders noticed something interesting. The communities that mastered all 7 techniques didn't just survive. They thrived. They produced more warriors. They accumulated more silver. They sent more ships across the whale road to raid and trade in distant lands. Knowledge meant power. Power meant survival. And survival meant everything. Let me tell you about young Astrid Runekeeper, because her story shows you just how seriously these people took this knowledge. Astrid was 12 years old when her time came for initiation, and this wasn't some gentle coming-of-age ceremony with cake and presents. This was a test administered under the dancing lights of the Aurora Borealis in the depths of midwinter, when making a mistake meant death. The assembled clan watched as this 12-year-old girl demonstrated each technique in turn. Her small hands, red with cold but steady as stone, coaxed flame from damp wood using reindeer moss and pine resin. Her young voice recited the 17 weather signs while blindfolded, calling out the subtle changes in wind direction and air pressure that would herald the next storm. Her knife carved the sacred symbols into tree bark, symbols that would mark clean water sources for future travelers who might pass this way and need to know where life could be found. Only when she had proven her mastery of all 7 techniques could Astrid wear the iron arm ring that marked her as one who could sustain life in the harshest conditions the world had to offer. At 12 years old, she possessed knowledge that could keep her alive in environments that would kill a modern person equipped with the finest camping gear money could buy. But here's what's truly remarkable about these techniques. They weren't just about individual survival. They were about community, resilience. They were about understanding that in a land where winter could last 8 months out of 12, nobody survived alone. These 7 techniques were interwoven with bonds of mutual obligation, with systems of resource sharing, with the understanding that your survival and your neighbor's survival were the same thing. When Ragnar Icewalker finally returned to his clan after those 40 days in the wilderness, gaunt, scarred, but undeniably alive, he brought with him something more valuable than silver or steel. He brought proof that the old ways still worked, that the ancient wisdom could still defeat the ancient enemy of cold and hunger and death. The elders nodded as they welcomed him back into the fold, because they understood what we're only beginning to rediscover, that true security doesn't come from dominating nature, but from learning to dance with her rhythms. That survival isn't about having the most advanced technology, but about having the deepest knowledge. And as Ragnar sat by the fire that first night back among the living, sharing his story with wide-eyed children who hung on every word, something was stirring in the world beyond Scandinavia. Ships were being built, weapons were being forged. The Vikings were about to burst onto the world stage, and when they did, they would carry with them these 7 techniques that had been tested in the crucible of the northern winter. Because what happened when you took people who had mastered survival in the world's harshest environment and set them loose on a world that had forgotten what real hardship looked like? Well, that's where our story really begins. When those dragon ships first appeared on the horizon at Lindisfarne in 793 after Christ, the monks who saw them thought the world was ending, and in a very real sense, it was, at least for them. These terrified holy men, clutching their crosses and muttering prayers, had no idea what they were actually looking at. They thought they were seeing demons sailing out of hell itself, come to punish them for their sins. They never understood. How could they? That what they were really witnessing was the arrival of the most sophisticated survival machine the medieval world had ever produced. These weren't just raiders drunk on bloodlust and berserker rage. These were the graduates of the harshest military academy on earth, the Scandinavian winter. And they were about to demonstrate what happened when you took people who had mastered survival in impossible conditions and turned them loose on a world that had grown soft. The monks saw the axes and the shields and the snarling dragon heads carved into the prows of those ships. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the real source of Viking power. It wasn't the weapons that made these warriors unstoppable. It was the logistics. It was the fact that while every other army in medieval Europe was constantly on the verge of starvation, the Vikings had solved the problem of keeping large numbers of men fed, healthy, and combat-ready for months at a time in hostile territory. Think about this for a moment. The standard medieval military campaign lasted maybe 6 weeks before armies started to disintegrate from hunger and disease. The Vikings? They could sustain operations for years. Years. And the secret wasn't superior agriculture or larger population bases. It was those 7 ancient techniques, weaponized and deployed on an industrial scale. Let me show you what I mean by telling you about the Great Heathen Army, probably the most successful military force of the 9th century, and one that changed the entire trajectory of English history. This massive Viking force landed in England in 865. After Christ, under the command of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. For 13 years, this army rampaged across England, conquering kingdoms that had stood for centuries. But here's the thing that medieval chroniclers never understood. The Great Heathen Army's success wasn't built on superior tactics or better weapons. It was built on superior survival knowledge. Take water procurement, for instance. Ivar the Boneless. And yes, that was apparently his real nickname, though historians still debate what it actually meant, understood something that English commanders never figured out. Water wasn't just about keeping your troops from dying of thirst. Water was a weapon. While Saxon armies relied on known wells and rivers that could be easily poisoned or blocked, Ivar's men could find clean water anywhere using those Danish bog-finding methods their grandmothers had taught them. But more than that, they used their water-finding skills offensively. Viking scouts would locate Saxon water supplies and contaminate them with rotting animal carcasses, forcing enemy armies to either retreat or die slowly from dysentery. Meanwhile, using techniques passed down from Norwegian mountain dwellers, they would dig new wells in seemingly impossible locations, securing clean water sources for their own forces, while their enemies literally died of thirst. The shelter techniques were just as devastating when applied to military operations. Remember those breathing shelters that kept Ragnar Icewalker alive during his 40-day ordeal? Halfdan and Ubba turned those principles into a revolutionary new form of mobile warfare. While Saxon armies had to retreat to permanent fortifications every winter, massive, expensive stone castles that took decades to build, the Vikings constructed temporary shelters based on Sami designs that could be assembled in hours and abandoned without loss. This meant the Vikings could maintain military pressure year-round. Think about the psychological impact of that. For centuries, warfare in northern Europe had followed predictable seasonal patterns. You fought during the summer months when the weather was good and food was available, and then everyone went home for the winter to tend their farms and wait for spring. The Vikings shattered that assumption completely. English kings would negotiate what they thought were temporary truces, expecting the Viking armies to sail home when winter arrived. Instead, they watched in horror as enemy forces settled in for months-long sieges, perfectly comfortable in shelters that breathed with the wind and trapped warmth while allowing deadly gases to escape. But the real game-changer was the food preservation techniques. This is where Viking superiority became absolutely overwhelming. While English armies subsisted on whatever they could forage or pillage, 20 fert, meaning they were constantly weakened by malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies, Vikings feasted on perfectly preserved fish and meat that maintained its nutritional value for months of campaigning. They had fermented whale blood that prevented scurvy on long ocean voyages. They had herb-infused mead that not only boosted morale but actually provided essential nutrients that kept their immune systems functioning. Most importantly, they had perfected techniques for preserving captured grain and livestock using Norwegian mountain methods, creating strategic food reserves that could sustain 3-year campaigns. Picture the siege of Paris in 885 after Christ, where this superiority became almost comically obvious. The Viking army under Rollo had been besieging the city for months, and the Frankish defenders were slowly starving behind their walls. The Vikings, meanwhile, were not only well-fed but actually gaining weight. Chronicles from the period describe Viking warriors as looking healthier after months of campaigning than Frankish soldiers looked at the beginning of conflicts. And this is where we need to talk about the women, because the expansion wasn't just about male warriors swinging axes. Women like Freydis Sharp-Tongue revolutionized the entire concept of battlefield logistics during that Paris siege. While the men fought on the walls and conducted raids, she organized the shield maidens to maintain the army's lifelines in ways that modern military strategists would recognize as absolutely essential to sustained operations. Freydis established hidden water collection points throughout the siege perimeter, using morning dew and rain-catching sails to supplement the army's water supplies. She taught captured Frankish slaves the art of blood sausage making, turning what would normally be waste products from butchered animals into protein-rich foods that could be stored without refrigeration. Most remarkably, she created portable hearths that could maintain ember fires for weeks of movement, ensuring that the army never lost its ability to cook food and stay warm regardless of weather conditions. Her saga tells us that she personally saved 3,000 warriors from winter starvation by adapting techniques she had learned from her grandmother's grandmother. 3,000 men. That's larger than most medieval armies at full strength, and she kept them fed and healthy, using knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Norse women who understood that survival was everybody's job, not just the warriors. As Viking expansion reached its peak, we see these 7 techniques being adapted to radically different environments with stunning success. When Rurik's warriors penetrated deep into the river systems of what would become Russia, they faced swamps and wetlands completely unlike their Scandinavian homeland. But they modified their ice-reading water-finding methods to work in frozen marshlands, locating clean water sources in terrain that killed less adaptable armies through disease and dehydration. Iceland's first settlers faced volcanic winters where traditional fuel sources were non-existent. They survived by combining traditional preservation techniques with geothermal cooking methods, using the island's natural hot springs to prepare foods in ways that conserved precious firewood while maintaining nutritional value. The archaeological record from early Icelandic settlements shows a population that was actually healthier and better fed than contemporary populations in mainland Europe, despite living in what should have been a marginal survival environment. And then there's Leif Eriksson's Vinland expedition, the Viking settlement in what we now call North America. The initial success of this colony, before it was eventually abandoned due to conflicts with indigenous populations, came from the settlers' ability to recognize American plants and animals that were similar enough to Scandinavian varieties that traditional preservation methods could be applied. They turned wild grapes into preserved foods using techniques originally developed for Nordic berries. They processed maize using methods their ancestors had perfected for barley and oats. Perhaps most importantly, expansion created a network of trading posts from Dublin to Constantinople, where Viking survival knowledge merged with local wisdom from dozens of different cultures. Arab merchants in the markets of Kiev marveled at Nordic fire-starting methods using crystallized pine pitch that could ignite in conditions where traditional materials failed. Vikings, in return, adopted Middle Eastern water purification techniques using silver coins and specific herb mixtures that killed waterborne pathogens. This cross-pollination created hybrid techniques that were more powerful than either tradition alone. A Viking trader who had learned desert survival methods from Bedouin merchants could operate in environments that would have killed his grandfather. An Arab navigator who had mastered Nordic star reading could guide ships through northern waters where traditional methods failed. By the 10th century, You had Viking warriors who could thrive in environments from Greenland's glaciers to Sicily's scorching shores, adapting their ancestral techniques to local conditions while maintaining the core principles that had kept their people alive in Scandinavia's killing winters. But empires built on knowledge face a unique vulnerability. What happens when that knowledge begins to disappear? What happens when the techniques that created your power are forgotten or abandoned? The answer to that question would define the next chapter of Viking history, and it wasn't a story that ended well. The cross came to Scandinavia not with the gentle message of peace and love that modern Christians might expect, but with the iron fist of kings who understood that political power and religious control were the same thing. When King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway looked out over his realm in 994 after Christ, he saw a problem that needed solving. His people were still clinging to the old ways, the techniques, the rituals, the entire worldview that had made the Vikings the most feared force in medieval Europe. And in Olaf's mind, that had to end. This wasn't about theology, this was about politics. The old ways created bonds of loyalty that bypassed royal authority. They preserved knowledge that made communities independent of centralized control. Most dangerously, they maintained a warrior culture that saw kings as temporary leaders rather than divinely appointed rulers. If Olaf wanted to build a kingdom that would last, he needed to destroy the foundation that Viking power was built on. So he declared the 7 techniques to be devil's work. Think about that for a moment. Techniques that had kept people alive for 500 years in the harshest environment on Earth were suddenly evil. Water finding using willow wands became witchcraft. Weather prediction through natural observation became demonic divination. The preservation methods that had sustained Viking armies across continents became forbidden practices that marked their users for persecution. The Vulvas, the wise women who preserved much of this knowledge, faced a simple choice: abandon everything their grandmothers had taught them, or burn. Most chose the flames. Throughout Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the smoky fires of book burning and execution consumed not just lives, but centuries of accumulated wisdom. Runic instructions for finding water were replaced with prayers for rain. Herbal preservation techniques gave way to holy salt that spoiled as often as it preserved. Weather prediction through bone aches and bird flights was abandoned in favor of divine providence that killed people who trusted it. Within 2 generations, survival knowledge that had taken millennia to develop crumbled like autumn leaves in a fire. The children who should have been learning these techniques were instead memorizing Latin prayers and Christian theology. The grandmothers who should have been passing down the old ways were dead or too terrified to speak. The cost of this cultural destruction became horrifically apparent at Stamford Bridge in 1066. After Christ, where Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, led 15,000 warriors to their doom in what should have been a straightforward conquest of England. But Harold's army wasn't the same kind of force that had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries. These warriors had been raised on Christian prayers rather than ancient techniques, and the difference was literally deadly. Picture this disaster unfolding. Harold's men, marching rapidly toward what they expected to be an easy victory, failed to properly preserve their supplies using the traditional methods their grandfathers would have considered elementary knowledge. Warriors who descended from men who could find water in any terrain died of thirst within sight of English streams because they had never learned the willow wand techniques that could locate clean sources. The fire-starting methods that had sustained their ancestors through Russian winters failed in Yorkshire's damp autumn because Christian priests had declared such knowledge unholy. By the time Harold Godwinson's English army caught up with them at Stamford Bridge, Harold's force was already weakened by entirely preventable logistical failures. Of those 15,000 warriors who had landed in England expecting to carve out another Viking kingdom, fewer than 1,000 returned to Norway. The rest died not just from English swords, but from the accumulated effects of forgotten wisdom. But the most tragic example of what happened when the old ways were abandoned played out over centuries in the Greenland colonies. This is a story that should chill anyone who thinks traditional knowledge is just quaint folklore that modern technology has made obsolete. Eric the Red established the Greenland settlements in 985, after Christ, using all 7 traditional techniques. These weren't desperate refugees clinging to survival in a marginal two-piece environment. These were thriving communities that had figured out how to prosper in what might have been the most challenging agricultural environment humans had ever attempted to master. The archaeological record shows us settlements with impressive stone buildings, successful livestock operations, and trade networks that reached back to Europe and possibly even to North America. But as Christianity took hold in Greenland, something deadly began to happen. The colonists started abandoning traditional preservation methods as heathen practices. They stopped reading weather signs in bird migrations, dismissing such observations as pagan superstition. They ignored the ice warnings that their ancestors had learned to read in the aching of joints and the behavior of seals. Most fatally, they abandoned the resource-sharing oath bonds that had ensured no family starved, while others had plenty. When the Little Ice Age arrived in the 13th century, bringing winters that were harsh, even by Greenlandic standards, the Christianized colonists were helpless. They starved to death, surrounded by seas full of seals that their ancestors would have easily hunted using traditional techniques. They froze in stone houses while their predecessors would have built breathing shelters that channeled heat efficiently. They died of thirst while sitting on top of aquifers their grandparents could have located with hazel rods. The last documentary evidence of the Greenland colonies dates to 1410. After Christ, a wedding certificate recorded by a priest who apparently had no idea he was documenting the final gasp of a civilization. When explorers finally returned to the settlements centuries later, they found only empty buildings and scattered bones. An entire Norse civilization had vanished, not because the environment had become impossible to survive in, but because they had forgotten how to survive in it. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The knowledge didn't completely disappear. It went underground, preserved by the people that mainstream Christian society considered outcasts and undesirables. Secret preservation of the techniques fell to society's margins. Wise women who risked execution to teach their granddaughters, hermits who claimed divine visions to justify their use of traditional methods, and isolated farmsteads beyond church reach, where the old ways continued in whispered defiance of official doctrine. Grandmother Thorun of Iceland's eastern fjords represents thousands of women who kept fragments of the knowledge alive at enormous personal risk. She taught her granddaughters water-finding techniques at night, swearing them to silence and disguising the instruction as games or storytelling. When church officials visited her remote farmstead, she would hide the willow wands and pretend her uncanny ability to locate wells was the result of divine blessing rather than ancient technique. Bjorn, wilderness walker, of northern Norway maintained the old shelter knowledge by claiming that divine visions instructed him in construction methods. This wasn't cynical deception. It was the only way he could preserve life-saving knowledge without being burned as a heretic. His divinely inspired shelters consistently outperformed Christian structures, but the knowledge he preserved was fragmentary compared to what had been lost. Most importantly, the Sami people of the far north, who had never been fully Christianized, became the last reservoir of pure Viking technique. Desperate Norwegians would travel to Sami territories during famine years, trading silver for knowledge their own grandfathers had possessed. The irony was bitter. The descendants of Viking raiders reduced to begging survival advice from the indigenous people their ancestors had once considered primitive. By the 14th century, what had once been the most sophisticated survival culture in medieval Europe had been reduced to fragments and whispers. The 7 techniques that had powered Viking expansion were remembered only in half-understood folktales and dangerous secret practices. The knowledge that had made Norse warriors unstoppable had become so thoroughly suppressed that most Scandinavians would have died in environments where their ancestors thrived. This wasn't just cultural loss, this was civilizational suicide. An entire society had voluntarily abandoned the knowledge base that had made them great, trading centuries of accumulated wisdom for the promise of salvation in an afterlife they could never verify. They had chosen faith over knowledge, authority over independence, and paid for that choice with the disappearance of their power from the world stage. But knowledge, real knowledge that keeps people alive, has a way of resurfacing when it's desperately needed. The techniques that had been driven underground by medieval Christianity would eventually prove their worth again, in circumstances that none of those long-dead kings and priests could have imagined. Sometimes it takes a world war to remind people that their ancestors might have known something worth remembering. 900 years after Harald Hardrada's warriors froze to death in Yorkshire, Norwegian resistance fighters huddled in mountain caves, desperately searching through their grandfathers' journals for something, anything, that might help them survive the Nazi occupation. These weren't historians or archaeologists, driven by academic curiosity. These were desperate people facing an enemy that controlled every town, every road, every official source of food and shelter in their homeland. And in those yellowed pages filled with what their Christian forebears had dismissed as pagan nonsense, they found salvation. The journals described shelter construction techniques that required no modern materials, ways of building structures that could keep men warm using nothing but snow, stones, and an understanding of prevested airflow that predated modern engineering by 1,000 years. They contained instructions for finding water in frozen ground, using methods that required no metal tools the Germans could detect. Most importantly, they preserved navigation techniques that allowed small groups of men to move across trackless wilderness without compasses or maps that enemy patrols might recognize. Operation Grouse, the sabotage mission that destroyed Nazi Germany's heavy water production facilities and probably prevented Hitler from developing atomic weapons, succeeded partly because Norwegian commandos used Viking, wayfinding methods to approach their targets. While German sentries watched for traditional military approaches using roads and known trails, the Norwegians moved through terrain using star navigation and landmark recognition that their ancestors had developed for ocean voyaging. They became invisible by becoming ancient. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The same knowledge that Christian kings had tried to destroy because it threatened their authority became the tool that defeated a totalitarian regime that represented everything those medieval rulers had aspired to become. The techniques that had been driven underground by the cross re-emerged to serve the cause of human freedom against an enemy that would have made Olaf Tryggvason look like a tolerant liberal. But World War II was just the beginning of our rediscovery of what Viking survival wisdom could teach us. Modern archaeology has vindicated ancient techniques in ways that would have astounded medieval skeptics. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in 1904, revealed preserved food samples that showed fermentation techniques so sophisticated they created portable nutrition lasting years without any form of refrigeration. When food scientists analyzed these samples, they found evidence of controlled bacterial cultures that modern industrial food processing has only recently begun to understand. Greenland ice cores, nature's own historical archive, contain chemical signatures proving that Vikings could predict weather patterns through atmospheric observations that modern meteorology dismissed as impossible until Type-Sifo plays. Satellite technology confirmed their accuracy. The primitive forecasting methods that Christian priests had condemned as devil worship turned out to be based on real atmospheric phenomena that require extremely sophisticated observation skills to detect. Most remarkably, NASA's Mars mission planners have studied saga descriptions of Viking star navigation, finding principles applicable to exploring worlds where magnetic compasses fail and GPS satellites don't exist. When you're trying to navigate on an alien planet where all your fancy technology becomes useless, suddenly the techniques that kept Viking explorers from getting lost on Earth's vast oceans become cutting-edge space science. Today, as climate change makes our modern infrastructure increasingly fragile, people around the world are rediscovering the practical value of ancient survival knowledge. Swedish bushcraft schools report 1,000-person waiting lists for courses teaching traditional fire methods using fungus and crystal. These aren't nostalgic hobbyists playing at being Vikings. These are urban professionals who understand that in a world where power grids fail and supply chains collapse, knowing how to create fire without matches or lighters could mean the difference between life and death. Urban homesteaders from Detroit to Berlin experiment with Viking preservation techniques, discovering that bog curing and salt packing create foods resistant to power grid failures in ways that refrigeration and modern canning methods cannot match. When the electricity goes out and the grocery stores empty, suddenly the ability to preserve meat using nothing but salt, herbs, and ancient knowledge becomes invaluable. Military survival instructors increasingly incorporate Viking shelter principles into their training programs, noting their superiority to high-tech solutions in extreme conditions. A shelter that breathes with the wind and channels heat, using principles discovered in medieval Scandinavia, often outperforms modern equipment that costs thousands of dollars and depends on materials that might not be available in crisis situations. But here's what's really important about this revival of ancient techniques. It's not just about individual survival skills. The 7 Viking techniques encoded something that modern society has largely forgotten: the understanding that community resilience matters more than individual preparedness. Viking waterfinding required teaching others your discoveries, because contaminated sources affected everyone. Fire starting demanded sharing precious ember carries between households, because letting your neighbor's fire die could doom the entire settlement. Preservation techniques worked best when neighbors coordinated salmon runs and reindeer hunts, because seasonal abundance had to be managed collectively. Weather prediction improved when elders compared joint aches and youngsters reported bird behavior, because accurate forecasting required multiple observation points and generational knowledge transfer. Resource sharing through iron-bound oaths wasn't just moral obligation. It was survival insurance that ensured no family starved while others had plenty. As one modern practitioner puts it, Vikings survived through connection, to nature, to ancestors, and to each other. That's the technique we've truly forgotten. In our hyper-individualized modern world, where people stockpile supplies in isolation and trust technology more than community knowledge, perhaps the most radical aspect of Viking survival wisdom isn't the technical skills, but the social framework that made those skills effective. Contemporary Scandinavia leads the resurrection of ancestral knowledge, but with a crucial difference from the secret preservation that sustained fragments through the dark centuries. Norwegian schools now mandate Viking weeks, where children learn all 7 techniques as part of their regular curriculum. This isn't historical reenactment. It's practical education for a world where traditional infrastructure might not always be reliable. Iceland's government funds vulva training programs, officially recognizing traditional knowledge as cultural heritage worthy of preservation and development. These modern vulvas, both men and women, study the old techniques alongside contemporary science, creating hybrid approaches that combine ancient wisdom with current understanding of ecology, meteorology, and nutrition. Denmark's military includes Viking survival techniques in special forces training, acknowledging that soldiers operating in extreme environments need knowledge that transcends technology. When your radio fails and your GPS stops working, the ability to stop working, navigate by stars, and find water using traditional methods becomes a combat multiplier that can determine mission success. These nations understand what their ancestors knew and what the rest of the world is slowly relearning: that true security comes not from technology that fails, but from wisdom that endures. Climate change is making weather patterns more unpredictable, exactly the kind of environmental volatility that the 7 techniques were designed to handle. Economic instability threatens supply chains that modern society depends on, creating exactly the resource scarcity situations that Viking preservation methods were meant to address. Most importantly, social fragmentation weakens the community bonds that provide resilience during crisis, exactly the kind of isolation that the Viking resource-sharing systems were designed to prevent. As global infrastructure becomes more complex and therefore more fragile, the world watches Scandinavia remember what Vikings never forgot: that survival is not about conquering nature, but about dancing with her ancient rhythms. The 7 techniques aren't museum pieces or romantic fantasies about a mythical past. They're tools for navigating an uncertain future where the comfortable assumptions of modern life might not hold. In a world where climate change brings unprecedented weather patterns, where economic collapse can empty grocery stores overnight, where social media creates connection without community, the ancient wisdom of people who survived in impossible conditions for 500 years might be exactly what we need to remember. The Viking Age didn't end because the techniques stopped working. It ended because people forgot that they worked. As we face challenges that our modern technology seems inadequate to address, perhaps it's time to remember what our ancestors knew: that the most sophisticated survival tool isn't a machine or a weapon or a communication device. It's knowledge. Knowledge that endures. Knowledge that connects us to the natural world, to our communities, and to the accumulated wisdom of everyone who ever faced impossible odds and lived to pass their techniques on to the next generation. The 7 sacred techniques that separated the living from the frozen dead in 8th century Scandinavia might just separate the thriving from the merely surviving in 21st century Earth. The choice, as always, is ours to make. But we'd better make it soon. Winter, in one form or another, is always coming.